Now, does the globalization of technology tend to erode national boundaries? Does it tend to weaken forces of nationalism?
It should. I think that in the real world, you will always have individual countries, individual regions looking out for themselves, kind of at the expense of other people. So before the program started, I was talking with one of the people here about Brazil, which has just introduced a local content law so that anything related to wireless communications has to have at least 50% local content. Well, okay, that means that the people who had been exporting computer chips to Brazil are going to have a lot harder time. But it also opened up a huge opportunity. IBM has invested $100 million, along with some Brazilian companies, in a major new semiconductor fab in Brazil. So everything keeps changing. I do think that with the internet and with data transfer, you really don't even know where your information is now. So that has become incredibly borderless, but yet the legal system hasn't kept up because you don't know if there's a problem, which court should be the court to try the legal problem in.
Now, some countries have radically different legal systems. Some countries feel very threatened by the internet. It's going to reveal too much information. It'll allow criticism of the government. This massive flow of information, do you think it's a totally beneficial thing, or does it carry some risks with it?
Of course it carries risks. And it carries a great deal of extra cost for companies that have to hedge their risks in different places. It used to be you could start a new product in some market and grow that market in a relatively good way, and then if you wanted to expand, that's great. But now, as soon as you announce a product anywhere, information about that product goes all over the world, and other people can re-engineer around it. You know, at the basic level, how do you handle the expenses of global competition when you really don't have time to grow a domestic market first?
And patents might not always work because not everybody respects patents. They could be copying your designs in other countries, and there's not a whole lot you can do.
Well, even if you don't get to the problem of enforcement, which is a big problem, the patent system now is that a patent protects you in one single country. If you want protection in multiple countries, you have to pay the fees for filing the patent and managing the patent in each one of those countries. There are ways to make that process easier, and it's a lot simpler process than it used to be, but it's still expensive. And if you're a startup company, that's a huge expense.
Is there any attempt to reform the patent system by internationalizing it so there would be something as an international patent in every country that subscribed to that treaty or whatever it was would be obliged to live up to it?
There's a lot of efforts in that direction. I think it will be a while before we actually have a truly borderless patent system. I think that individual countries don't want to give up their control so much.
Now, if there's a lot of innovation in other countries, let's say China or Korea or Japan, is that good for the United States, or does it threaten the United States if they start to get ahead of us?
Well, certainly we have to be competitive, right? And we have to compete against people that we didn't used to have to compete against. So that's a new challenge. On the other hand, if you look at it as playing sports in a big league, the better the whole league, the better you will be as a performer. And I think that that's probably what's happened. Now, China's in an unusual situation because it's still in the middle of this huge growth from almost zero 30 years ago. And so China is having so many opportunities in the domestic market that most Chinese companies are actually remarkably domestically focused. They're not really trying to go global yet. Only a few companies like Huawei, like Haier, like some of the other companies that are working with, like Foxconn that's doing manufacturing for foreign firms in China, have really thought globally. So China's in a slightly different position. They're still building out their domestic infrastructure so much. But Japan, especially Korea only has, 40 million people, 45 million people in South Korea. So if you really want to have a good, successful technology and you're in Korea, you have to think globally very early. So they actually are very forward-looking in going into global markets.
Now, the companies gain certain advantages not only by having cheaper labor, but by also having looser environmental regulations, because that's part of the cost of doing business in most countries.
Yeah, to a certain extent, that doesn't apply so much in Japan and Korea as it does in China. Japan and Korea are advanced. They're very concerned about the quality of the environment. There's, I think, more issues in China because there's so much development inside China itself. The East Coast cities, average income is probably around $18,000 or $19,000 a year. Inside the interior, the average income is probably around $3,000 a year. To have that much difference in incomes within a country puts an awful lot of stress on it. And one of the ways that it's trying to get by is things that we would not like in regard to environmental policies. But ultimately, it's fascinating what that's done to Chinese consumers. The rollout of the China domestic economy is shifted to really consumer lines of business being the real driver of economic growth now. And Chinese consumers are buying a lot of foreign products because they feel that they're safer than the products made in China.
I've heard that a lot of products coming from China might be of some dubious quality. They compete very well on price. I'm not sure what else they compete on.
Well, we've had some bad experiences here. And of course, a few bad experiences make everything look bad. But I think that a lot of that was price-based competition. The window of price-based competition is not going to last that long in China. The East Coast cities are already approaching a level where they're not that far away from the costs in Korea. And that means that they're already seeing a flow offshore of some jobs, not only into the interior of China, but down into other countries like Vietnam.
Well, now that we've embarked on the path of technology, do you think that this will just go on forever, or is this kind of a historic bubble that will come to an end, like most things come to an end?
I have to say, I think we're really in the middle of the newest industrial revolution. If you look at the early 1800s being the first industrial revolution, and then the rise of mass manufacturing being the second revolution at the beginning of the 1900s, we're now in the information technology version of the Industrial Revolution. Life is not going to go back to the way that it was. With the possible, terrible cataclysmic, if it's not like Einstein said, where World War IV will be fought with bows and arrows, as long as we don't have something that destroys civilization as we know it, I don't think we're going to go back. Technology is a part of our lives. We're living our lives in a different way than our parents did, or even as we did when I was a young person.
Now, what's the implication of all the information technology, aside from the money to be made by people who manufacture it and sell it? Is it changing the world in a fundamental way? The fact that you can see what's going on all over the world, and you can't keep secrets anymore because you're being spied on all the time.
True, but the data itself doesn't have much value. What I see is an awful lot of data everywhere, and now the new wave of new kinds of businesses that's just emerging are the companies that are getting value out of that data, out of that information. Now, at the end of the day, every piece of information that's out there was donated by some person. And I do have a kind of suspicion that maybe people are going to decide that donating their information for the sake of some company's profit is not a pattern that they want to continue doing so much. I think privacy is an issue that everybody's concerned with. Always technology will take a lead and go forward. You'll have technology, people will have to deal with the problems that the technology creates. Unfortunately, I don't see any change to that pattern. I think we will solve most of the problems, but it is a continuing process.
Now, do you think that ultimately technology will bring the human race together, or are there some divisions that are so great they're not going to be bridged by any kind of technology?